Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about claims of fact. Now, the first thing I want to make clear is that a claim of fact is different from a statement of fact. A statement of, and somewhat the difference depends on context, but a specific kind of context. Basically, whether or not the fact is well established and or accepted by the audience. So a claim of, so a statement of fact would simply be a thing that people agree on, right? It's a fact statement. That is, it is a statement about something that can be objectively measured in the world. It needs to be sort of objectively verifiable. Other people need to be able to check it. It cannot be subjective in that sense. It needs to be concretely measurable. There needs to be some metric that can be applied to determine whether or not that statement is true, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a statement of fact. A claim of fact would be an argument that something is true. And there's a number of reasons you might have to do this. Basically, it asserts that a particular condition existed, will exist, whatever it is. It tells us something about the world. Now, why might you need to do this? Well, there's a few different reasons. One is that there may be different interpretations of data, right? Two scientists can look at the same information and draw different conclusions. And if it's a question of what does this tell us about the world, then it's a question of fact. If it's a question of is this good or bad, whatever it is, it's a question of values. If it's what should be done, it's a question of policy. But if it's a question of what does this information tell us about the world, then that's a question of fact. So if we take, for example, a very contentious topic in the US right now, student loan debt relief. There are different ways of calculating student loan debt. There's different ways of calculating the average that the average amount of debt that a student will incur over a lifetime of a university career. These would be things that you could interpret differently. And part of the reason you might interpret them differently is because of differing methodologies. But you could make the argument that this is the factual, true amount of student loan debt that exists because this is the best way of calculating it, for instance. So that's one instance in which you may have differing interpretations of the data. You may also sort of look at the data and draw different conclusions based on what trends you're looking at. So, for instance, if you look at the total amount of student loan debt without comparing that to inflation, you may come to a very different conclusion than if you look at the total amount of student loan debt adjusted for inflation over a period of time. So again, these are where different interpretations may come in. Another reason you might end up making a claim of fact is because you want to establish a causal relationship. If you want to say, this piece of information caused this piece of information, or this trend, this event, this occurrence, whatever it is, has a causal relationship with this one, you have to make that argument because causal relationships are not always clear. There's a very common saying that people use all the time, and it is accurate, that correlation does not equal causation. Two events may occur consecutively. One happens and then the other happens without the first one necessarily having caused the other. They may be coincidental. And so if you want to argue that there is a causal relationship or not a causal relationship, you could go the other direction. That would be another way of doing this. That's an argument of fact. To continue with the student loan debt, You could make the argument that decreases in the relative amount of funding provided by states and the federal government for higher education has caused increases in tuition, which have caused increases in the amount of student loans students need to take out. There you've got a 3-point causal relationship, right? A relative decrease in the amount of government funding leads to increases in tuition. That leads to increases in the amount of debt accrued. Now, you would have to support that argument with evidence, which you could do, but that would be a fact-based argument built on the premise of establishing causal connections. Another type of fact-based argument you might need to make is if you're making predictions about what will happen based on either the current situation or potential future situations. If the student loan debt crisis is not resolved, we will see decreases in rates of home ownership because millennials, Gen Z, simply won't be able to afford mortgage payments in the way that previous generations were. This is a predictive argument. You can, and to the extent that if the student loan debt crisis is not resolved, to the extent that that implies a policy decision, that's a sort of policy-based thing. But if the core of the argument is homeownership rates will go down because student loan debt payments take up the money that could otherwise go to mortgages, this is a predictive argument. You are predicting a factual trend that will occur. One thing to remember with predictions, one thing to be cautious about is the slippery slope fallacy. If the argument was, for instance, if the student loan debt crisis is not resolved, millennials and Gen Z will all end up living in a van down by the river. This is not the most likely outcome. So this would be the slippery slope. But since we've already got sort of indications that rates of home ownership among millennials are lower than they are among previous generations, we can make a reasonable argument for this while avoiding the slippery slope fallacy. So that's one thing you do want to be aware of. Another reason you might make a factual argument is because new data has emerged. This happens all the time. We discover new things, people come up with new ideas, new understandings, something changes the way we look at information, and things that had previously been sort of accurate, factual arguments are now no longer accurate. New information has changed what we know. And so we have to reassess the data. And so sometimes it is just a question, and that's a sort of interesting one, right, in terms of making factual arguments, because if it's new information now, and I make this factual argument presenting new data, then as soon as that fact is established and accepted, it's no longer new data. So that's a very sort of temporally constrained type of argument, is if that argument succeeds, it ceases to be the type of fact-based argument it is and just becomes a statement of fact. So that's an interesting one where you may undergo that sort of transition. Now, one thing to remember with claims of fact is that a claim of fact is a fact-structured statement. What I mean by that, again, is that it is a statement about something that can be objectively measured in the world. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. There is a difference between stating something as a fact and it being objectively true. Now, many facts are objectively true, but people also make fact statements about the world that are not true. The statement that the earth is flat is not true. Sorry, flat earthers, if you don't like it, you can comment. But scientifically, that is a fact. There is no compelling argument against it. But it's a claim of fact that the earth is flat. That is a thing that is about the objective world that exists, and it is measurable. Therefore, it is a fact statement, even though it's incorrect. So again, this is one thing that's important to keep in mind with claims of fact. A claim of fact does not equal the truth. It equals a statement about the world that can be objectively measured. The other thing that you want to be thinking about if you're making a claim of fact is whether or not you need to incorporate what we call qualifiers. So qualifiers limit the scope of an argument, right? So if I say university graduates have student loan debt, what that suggests is that all university graduates have student loan debt. If even one person has graduated without student loan debt, my argument is not accurate anymore. But if I say most graduates have student loan debt, or the overwhelming majority of graduates, the bulk of graduates, anything like this, anytime I put one of those qualifiers on there that allows for exceptions to the argument, then the fact is much more likely to be true or to be accepted as true. One of the potential sort of squishy parts with qualifiers may be that with terms like most, often, sometimes, frequently, occasionally, etc., these are not necessarily objectively measurable terms. I mean, how many is most? Right? So if I say, well, most is 51% or more, you might say, okay, I don't really think that. I don't think that that's most. Yeah, it's more than half, but for me, most needs to be more like, 70%. So because this is where it gets a little bit tricky in terms of claims of fact, because qualifiers are not objectively measurable unless you have a sort of external set of standards you're applying to it. It's easier to say something that is true, but it decreases the measurable objective quality of it. You would definitely want to be able to say, well, here is what I mean by most, or here's what I mean by many, or here's what I mean by rarely, or whatever it is. You would want to be able to say that and make some kind of reasoned argument that your particular qualifier applies here. But because a qualifier is not as concrete and specific, this may be where you would run into more debate, more room for debate